for over 37 months, Russia has been at war with Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Rupke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we begin with a horrific massacre carried out by the Russian army this morning in Sumy, a city of 250,000 residents located in Ukraine's northeast. We are looking at images that are truly disturbing. Much of it we have to pixelate, and we can see the double ballistic missile attack on Sumy. Here we see the first images from this morning, and these images show us that an attack has already taken place, and this attack has hit the building here to our left. It concerns the Congress Center of the State University in Sumy, and we can now observe that the damage here remains relatively contained and not extensive. Specifically, it seems the missile struck inside the building, essentially tearing everything apart from within. Debris is scattered across the street, windows are torn out, but thankfully there have been few casualties so far. And here, a TV crew was just about to film on location with the mayor, aiming to inspect and document these damages in detail. And now we're witnessing sheer shock. Just as they were about to begin, right as they were starting to assess the damages, there was another sudden attack, about 200 meters away, 200 meters further east. And we're seeing the inferno now, and we're about to witness the truly gruesome images. At least 31 dead, dozens injured is what we currently have to report. There are likely still rising numbers of casualties. And this second attack also targeted the Academy Street, that's what it's called. So the street where the university facilities are located, and it struck at an intersection, a very busy intersection. We can see it impacted the public transport. It hit buses that were passing through the area at the time, and it struck very close to the University Hospital, which is also located on the very same street nearby, just like the University Congress Center, which was the first location to be hit. Of course, this whole thing shows us that it's not a random attack. This isn't something the Russians can claim, saying the Ukrainians intercepted our missiles and they just landed somewhere. First of all, these are ballistic missiles that were utilized in the attack here today. That means they're already extremely challenging to intercept. On the other hand, when two ballistic missiles land within 200 meters of each other within just half an hour, then that is undeniably a deliberate attack, an attack, period. At the start of the Easter weekend, targeting many believers who had gathered here, intending to go to a nearby church as well. A church I myself visited just 2 weeks ago in Sumy's center. Located about 600 meters from here, we had lunch there, and so of course the whole thing was a huge shock. That this center of a 250,000 inhabitant city is now deliberately being attacked with two ballistic missiles from Russia. Let's take a look at the map and find out exactly where Sumy is located and why it continues to be such a thorn in the side of the Russians, given that Sumy remains under Ukrainian control and serves as a base for organizing resistance against the invasion. And we can see that Sumy is not located close to these major battlefields in the Donbass or the southern regions of Zaporizhia and Kherson. Instead, Sumy is here, located up here in the north. Approximately, and this makes it very dangerous, about 30 kilometers from the border with Russia. And we have the situation where the Ukrainian army has been advancing towards Kherson in recent months, aiming to relieve the pressure on both the eastern and southern fronts significantly, as well as currently, we see it here very, very small, a small period. Yes, a small incursion, or at least a small occupation of two villages in the Belgorod region right there. And this whole situation has been on Putin's radar since August, when the Ukrainian diversionary attack began, aimed at tying down Russian units far from the front lines. From the front in the east, today's attack by Russia here on Palm Sunday, the very last day of Lent, is undeniably a deliberate strike targeting civilians in Sumy to exact revenge on Ukraine and the people of Sumy for persistently standing against the invasion. From Sumy, we make our way to the Donetsk region, where we focus on the central front area between the cities of Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, observing the ongoing developments there. That Russia has launched a new, stronger offensive here in the past 2 weeks, and we first take a look at new footage showing that Kalinova has already become the third location captured within just a few days. As always, we see scenes of total devastation, entire villages destroyed, leaving only ruins behind, but we also spot the flag of the Russian invaders, hoisted here on yet another building in this case. Kalinove. And this whole place is one where the Ukrainians haven't paid much attention so far because it's located between several major cities and doesn't directly enable an attack on a major city. Nevertheless, it now seems the Russians are pushing forward here because they've identified this weak spot in the Ukrainian defense, and within just 2 weeks they've taken about 40 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. Let's start by examining the map, and then we'll move forward from there, which shows us the situation, as I mentioned, here at the center of the front between the major cities, showing us the situation on the 21st March of this year. And we can clearly observe here that Kalinove remains entirely under Ukrainian control, just like Oleksandropil and Pantelei-Monivka, another town that was still firmly in Ukrainian hands here in March, where dozens of Ukrainian soldiers were actively defending these positions. Now let's let the whole thing play out and take a look at the current situation. That means about 3 weeks later, we now see all 3 locations under Russian occupation. And this whole situation is particularly complicated and challenging for Ukraine because we have a strategically important road here that leads up to Konstantinivka. That's the H20, and this road is crucial for the Russians to advance further in the center of the front between Bukivsk here on the left side and Torezk and New York here on the right side. And we also have new footage from Konstantinivka revealing that the Russian army is now deploying fiber optic guided drones to directly target the city, which poses a significant and ongoing challenge for the defenders on the front lines, further complicating their defensive efforts. Because until now, Konstantinivka was considered a relatively safe place. Zrenia, aside from Russian artillery attacks and missile strikes, which of course have a very long range. But now we see that the Russians are capable coming here from Chasiv Yar. We'll look at that in a moment. Coming from Chasiv Yar with their fiber optic guided kamikaze drones directly hunting in the center of the city, targeting and attacking individual vehicles of the Ukrainian army. We now see a terrain vehicle that was parked in a park in the northeast of the city, and here we witness an attack by the Russians, which is quite intriguing and noteworthy to observe. We see the first strike, and the Russians are also using a second drone, even though we can see the vehicle was already hit, already damaged. But just to make absolutely certain it can't drive away, a second fiber-guided kamikaze drone is directed straight into this specific vehicle. We're looking at the map here, and as mentioned, we see Konstantinivka, a town in a very precarious position between different frontline sectors, namely Torezk to the south. We had just witnessed earlier, this was the H20, where the Russians are striving to push forward and once more carry out this flanking operation to completely disrupt Ukrainian supply routes from the west. What we just observed was a particular zone situated in the northern or northeastern district of the city. And when we look at the whole picture, it's about 10 kilometers to Chasiv Yar into the next Russian-occupied area. And that's just 10 kilometers, so perhaps even more, that the Russians can now cover with these fiber optic drones, or the distance they are capable of handling and navigating through effectively. And therefore, it's extremely dangerous for the Ukrainians because they can no longer move safely in Konstantinivka. As I said, safety is always relative. It's already been a target for artillery and other such attacks. But these highly precise attacks targeting individual soldiers, individual vehicles in the city, the Russians have only been able to do that for a few days since they advanced further in Chasiv Yar. Intense fighting continues around Torezk. Additionally, there's the report that the Russians are attempting to push further along this road. There was a 6-kilometer advance reported over the past few days, which allegedly was repelled by the Ukrainians. At least there is no new footage. Still, the situation in Konstantinivka is becoming increasingly difficult as Russian forces are advancing from multiple directions, including the southeast, the northeast, and the southern areas, intensifying the pressure. As we just saw in Kalinove below, the Russians are attempting to advance from 3 directions toward Konstantinovka, surrounding the city and ultimately aiming to seize control of it as well. And now we want to take a look at another attack near Torezk here. We also have new footage here showing the Russians deploying a variety of vehicles. First, there are 2 armored buses, if you will. These are Bukanka types, not your classic tanks or armored personnel carriers, but rather essentially civilian vehicles, or at least very lightly armored ones, repurposed for military use, which are now being deployed here. And we can see they're trying to advance with them and are currently being attacked by the Ukrainian army, in this case by the Azov National Guard. All of these vehicles are taking hits. Nevertheless, they continue moving forward and are deploying their troops. At least in part where they are supposed to go. We've already seen the Burkankas, and now we're seeing more vehicles here. This here, entirely civilian vehicles, that's a UAZ, a semi-military off-road vehicle. But the one on the left, and this is particularly interesting, is unmistakably a Lada, currently in use here, a civilian vehicle with its doors removed. Why? So you can jump out really quickly, precisely at this moment when Ukrainian drones strike and attack the whole thing. And interestingly, the Russians also clearly have this vehicle here, this civilian one, which seems to be part of their setup. unarmored vehicle chosen to transport ammunition, and we're seeing it now, namely a massive explosion of this very vehicle. Here it is on the left side, just going up in flames now. This definitely means ammunition was being transported here, likely to the probably already forward deployed units who have advanced north of Torezk in recent days. We can see this is turning into yet another massacre for the Russian army, which is once again losing 100% of the deployed vehicles and likely a significant portion of the troops as well. Nevertheless, they have the opportunity. We see here more vehicles are being deployed. They have the ability to sacrifice so many men and so many vehicles and thereby gain control in this region, particularly in the Torez region, the Chasiv Yar area, and we've witnessed it further south near New York and Kalinove, capturing more Ukrainian territory and persistently pushing their offensive forward. Why? Because the Ukrainians simply don't have the sheer mass of soldiers and vehicles, and as a result are unable to defend themselves in a way that can counter these attacks on the ground, not just from the air, using the drones they've strategically deployed in this area. We can see it here. All the Russians are getting out. And even though it's quite chaotic, we can see this Russian struggling with his machine gun, which has clearly gotten stuck in the drone net. Nevertheless, the situation remains intense. Most of the Russians are getting out. We likely already have wounded here who are having trouble getting out. But that's exactly the Russian calculus that in this case, we probably even have 3/4 of those who are supposed to be transported in this vehicle. And those who survive or those who manage to find shelter there within the various buildings available. The Ukrainians are still active here, now focusing on the buildings. Nonetheless, we see that these are relatively small explosions, in this case likely kamikaze drones again, and not the heavy artillery that would be needed. Also perhaps the cluster munitions necessary to effectively combat the Russians here in these villages, where they've managed to regain a solid foothold once more. And these kinds of attacks aren't just taking place here in the vicinity of Torezk, but are also being reported further south in the country, particularly around the broader region of Velika Novosilka. Here as well, we're seeing a new attack by the Russian army, in this case, once again, 2 quads being used, loaded with plenty of infantry. And we can observe, yes, it's a Ukrainian video, meaning they're specifically showing us the 110th, in this case, 110th Brigade. You see, we have indeed destroyed it. We have made sure that all these vehicles can no longer be used. But let's just let it run and see. Essentially, the Russians have successfully accomplished their goal here once again. Here we see the 2 quads, as mentioned, being deployed, and now we can see the infantry dismounting. Soon we'll witness the series of explosions. Right now we're observing the first drone as it directly strikes a vehicle, followed immediately by the second drone, which lands just beside the other vehicle. Nonetheless, we let it continue as it's another facility, a defensive installation, a long-constructed trench system built by the Ukrainian army, which here falls under Russian control. Specifically in Bolatske near Velika Novosilka, as mentioned, you can see it right there on the map. And essentially, the Russians have achieved their goal here, namely advancing once again, even though we now see that all the vehicles have been hit multiple times, rendering them inoperable. And all these trench systems we see, hopefully you can recognize that, they've already been deliberately and extensively overbuilt for added protection. Not just dug out, but they've also incorporated concrete and wood into it. They started building these protective roofs to defend against Russian drone strikes, allowing people to move safely from one location to another unharmed. And all these defensive structures that were constructed by Ukraine are now under Russian control. So essentially, it's yet another strategic advantage. And now let's take a closer look at just how relatively massive this facility really is. That means it's not just a few meters, but hundreds of meters that have been excavated here. And as mentioned, this facility is now also under Russian control. Of course, the Ukrainers can always say, well, we are killing the Russians when they are there, at least a large part of them. But the reality is, some of the Russian soldiers survive, receive additional reinforcements, and continue to push forward in a northwestern direction. Velika Novosilka, as mentioned, was already captured several weeks ago, and what we've just observed in that recent footage was Bulatske. This is that small village. The footage came from just south of it, another Ukrainian defensive position where the Russians have now gained a foothold. And from there, of course, in the coming weeks and months, advancing further towards the country's center, moving towards the city of Koma, and also towards the Dnepropetrovsk region, to push into this area with the ultimate goal of launching a decisive assault on the very heart of Ukraine as well. Not only in Donetsk, but also in Kharkiv, the Russian army continues to press forward steadily. And we've got some pretty dramatic footage here that clearly shows they still have access to both tanks and armored vehicles. However, these two were completely wiped out in that instance. These are recordings from the 43rd Brigade of the Ukrainian army. These recordings show once again that these so-called turtles or garages, essentially fortified tanks and armored personnel carriers, were indeed deployed. We also see the Z painted on the front by the Russians, clearly marking their origin and affiliation. It's evident that these vehicles managed to reach another forest position, but were then attacked and ultimately destroyed in that exact spot. Yeah, what exactly it is pretty hard to tell because it's already burning so intensely. The other one was definitely a tank, and now we're about to see another vehicle, a BTR, which was also deployed here to transport soldiers across the area. And in this case, I have to say, we're showing only a small portion of the footage because you can see dozens of Russian dead lying around these vehicles, which of course were also each individually targeted after the vehicles were taken out. Now here, only one of them is pixelated, but definitely the Russian army continues to use vehicles in this area as well. And as we just said, there are loaders, there are Bukanka vans, and there are quads. Then that is certainly accurate for some sections of the front. In other sections of the front, as we can see here, the Russian army still has tanks and armored personnel carriers. Of course, it's always important to add that these are constantly new waves. That means from the Ukrainian side, they might have managed to successfully destroy several dozen tanks and armored personnel carriers. The Russians are now restricted to advancing with only civilian vehicles. However, they continue to produce and resupply their forces constantly and without pause within Russia. That means the supply chain from Russia into Ukraine is still continuing to function quite effectively. And that means that every single month, an additional 50 to 100 tanks and armored vehicles can indeed reach Ukraine and be effectively deployed there. That means when we describe this situation where certain locations no longer have military vehicles present, then it's essentially a description of the current state of affairs on the ground. But it doesn't mean that next week or next month, dozens of Russian tanks could once again be deployed in this area. And we'll explore one more strategy the Ukrainians are using to stop or at least significantly slow down these advances. Here's a relatively rare sight by now, a hidden Russian self-propelled artillery piece, a somewhat uncommon image. I hope you can see it. So here the artillery piece is hidden. Over here, its gun is aimed, and this is a 2S1 Gvozdika, a self-propelled artillery piece of the Russian army. At the start of the war, we saw dozens or even hundreds. Over time, they dwindled significantly, destroyed by Ukrainians as their range simply wasn't enough to escape the Ukrainian drones. Here we have the situation where the Russians have once again brought one of these artillery pieces to the front, yet that remains their core problem. They've been spotted once more by Ukrainian surveillance drones. And we'll see right away that it's not artillery, but in fact kamikaze drones being deployed here. Here we see the attack on those standing right over there. And now we can observe how the fire suddenly breaks out in this specific area. We can see that the ammunition has been ignited. That's why there's this massive fire next to the building over there. And we can see that the 2S1 there has caught fire. And that's precisely the reason, one of the reasons why the Ukrainians are indeed capable of slowing down the Russians and also diminishing their firepower. On the other hand, there's just so much material, both from the Cold War era, which the Soviet Union built back then, and also new material in some cases. When it comes to self-propelled guns, there's little, but regarding tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, the Russians are deploying new material to advance and pressure Ukraine further. Regarding new material, let's take a look at highly innovative, cutting-edge Russian drones that are now being deployed to intercept Ukrainian drones. Over the past weeks and months, we've repeatedly shown how Ukraine has managed to reprogram FPV kamikaze drones so that they can not only strike on the ground, but target Russian drones at 2 to 4 kilometers. However, the Russians have not been idle during this time and have constructed something quite modern here, specifically an interceptor that can be deployed and launched directly from the hand. We see it here. This is an anti-drone unit of the Russian army. On the right, we see someone holding a shotgun. The Ukrainian soldiers tell us these are also very effective at stopping drones that are flying directly at you, especially in close-range situations. This here is a drone hunter of the Russian army, an interceptor that can be launched by hand. We're seeing it now. It can be launched by hand and directly attacks Ukrainian drones. Here's the attack in progress. It's been clearly observed here. This catapult doesn't require setup and is simply held in the arm. They're targeting the Ukrainian drone, and now a drone pilot takes control, carefully guiding the approach toward the specific target. We just saw the approach, but now we're seeing various videos that Russian propagandists have released in recent days that here, for example, a Ukrainian surveillance drone is being targeted and attacked. At this moment, we're observing an attack on a darts drone, a strike drone used by the Ukrainian military, which can carry up to 6 kilograms and has a range of 50 to 60 kilometers. And we even see during this, within a relatively short flight time of about 45 minutes at most, the Russians managed to track this drone, first spotting it, then tracking it, and now attacking it with a fighter jet. Here we see the successful Russian interception of this darts drone, and finally another surveillance drone, which is also being targeted by these Russian fighter jets and most likely will be brought down as well. That means the Russians, even though we keep saying, well, they are deploying so many troops, and that is certainly an absolute meat grinder that's being instigated by Putin. At the same time, there's always new high-tech, always new innovations. The Russian army and the Russian defense industry are quite capable of adapting to the current circumstances. In that case, we just saw that the Ukrainians were faster because they built interception drones. Now, the Russians are also creating new modern and highly efficient ones. In other cases, for example, we remember those large cages over vehicles against drones. It was the Russians who did that first. People laughed at them a lot, saying, "What are those, garages or turtles or whatever?" Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are building very similar frames around their Western vehicles to protect them against drones, against Russian drones. In other words, you see these constant measures and countermeasures, and always these attempts to adapt various weapon systems to diminish the opponent's overall efficiency. This occurs from both sides and remains very active from the Russian side, even in the war's fourth year.